Felicitations and greetings from this cavern of canvases.
Welcome to our first ever Night Gallery Spotlight. Today we'll be discussing a segment as chosen by all of you, the waiting room. Fittingly, this eerie tale comes from some of the key creative forces behind Night Gallery. For starters, the waiting room was directed by Jeannot, Szwarc, who helmed numerous segments throughout the show. Szwarc had a prominent career in both TV and film, but comic book fans will likely remember him for Supergirl, and horror fans will know him for his work on Jaws 2. But the main reason this is an ideal place to begin our journey into Rod Serling's Night Gallery is this is one of many segments written by Serling himself. While it's often debated exactly how much creative control Serling had on the series, one thing is for sure, his fingerprints are all over this one.
Well, don't let me crimp you, gentlemen. Go ahead and play.
The Waiting Room was one of two segments featured in Season 2, Episode 18. It first aired on January 26, 1972, alongside Last Rites for a Dead Druid. Before we go into The Waiting Room, please note, spoilers are ahead.
Item number 1. In a $12.50 pine box reposes the body of a frontier Frankie, armed but disarming. A victim of an Old West philosophy that any man with a good eye, a limber finger, and a well-honed trigger skirts the pastures of immortality. But this chap found out the hard way that immortality is a wish, a word, but infrequently a reality. He awaits your pleasure in a painting we call The Waiting Room.
We open on a rather morbid scene as a man on horseback named Sam Dichter, as played by Steve Forrest, comes across someone who was executed by hanging. Soon after, Mr. Dichter finds his way to a dusty old saloon where he encounters four men playing cards and a mysterious bartender as played by Gilbert, Roland. Now, this Old West setting may only have a modest TV budget, but most everything here feels authentic, from the battered dwelling itself to its grizzled inhabitants.
Was this busy?
More or less.
And naturally, there's some Twilight Zone veterans in the mix.
I'm betting, gentlemen.
Easily the most well-known player here is Buddy Ebsen of Beverly Hillbillies fame. Ebsen plays Doc Soames, a much-needed calm and level-headed presence within this group.
Well, patience, brother. I gotta make damn sure who I'm playing poker with.
Our cast is rounded out with another Twilight Zone veteran, Albert Salmi as Joe Bristle. And our final two players are Jim Davis as Abe Bennett and Lex Barker as Charlie McKinley, both of whom had previous experience in westerns. Although Davis is better known for his work on Dallas, Barker was known for his role as the 10th official Tarzan. And for those of you keeping count, over 30 actors have played Tarzan over the years. That's not including Chewbacca. Anyway, from the onset, it's clear something in this saloon is very off.
A lightning draw and a devilish deadly aim. You're known, Mr. Dichter.
Somehow everyone here already knows who Mr. Dichter is, despite the fact that initially he can't recall any of them. And I like this hook. It gets our imaginations going as to what may actually be going on here.
Who's that Johnny I seen strung up on the hill?
Some gunner. A killer.
Eventually, Dichter asks the bartender if he witnessed the hanging. The bartender says that sort of thing gives him no pleasure, but Dichter's callous response is our first clear sign of the kind of guy we're dealing with.
Well, he never bothered me. As a matter of fact, if they kick a little and squirm around and take their time doing it, well, brother, they don't bother me a bit.
Soon, the clock on the wall strikes 9, and McKinley is reminded it's time for him to go. But where's he going? Well, that's where things get interesting. At this point, it becomes fairly obvious we're in the afterlife.
It's that hour.
Interestingly, time itself is still meaningful within this context. The men in this bizarre waiting room are here for a reason, and we learn why when McKinley leaves the saloon and gunfire is heard. From here on, the segment plays out in the same manner. One by one, each player is summoned to relive their own demise. There are a few aspects I found intriguing as this scenario played out. First, I like that we only get glimpses and hear sounds outside, as opposed to actually witnessing the events unfold. Allowing each of these dark events to play out in our imaginations is very effective. But another interesting aspect of this tale is the entire time these guys are forced to relive their demise, Dictor remains in a state of confusion and denial.
I know it's fever. None of this is happening.
While some critics view Dictor's obliviousness as a stretch, at the very least I'd say it plays up the fact that Mr. Dictor isn't the brightest bulb in the box, as is specifically noted in the segment.
Where you going?
Damn your eyes, Dictor. Your wits slog along like a crippled mule, don't they?
On a deeper level, I think the fact that Dictor takes so long to catch on is consistent with what we know of his character. He's barreled through life, guns blazing, devoid of empathy, and willfully ignorant. So there's no reason to expect his moral compass or his brains to suddenly start working anytime soon.
I'm afraid there's no more time.
In any case, as the segment draws to a close, the clock strikes to 1, and our ever ominous bartender states exactly where Mr. Dictor is.
Some call it, hell.
With that, Mr. Dictor steps outside to face his own punishment. Soon after, we see him on horseback, as in the beginning, and once again he approaches the corpse hanging from the tree. However, this time he pulls away the shroud and sees his own face. Dictor then heads back to the saloon, and wouldn't you know it, we're right back where we started. The waiting room may be one of the more grim and somber segments from Night Gallery, but it's also a standout in Serling's run.
I guess there are some people who have a taste for death. You're looking at one, brother.
The cast delivers across the board with performances that range from gloomy and solemn to headstrong and volatile, especially when it comes to our lead gunslinger, as played by Steve Forrest.
I think this whole shebang is a loony bin. I think you're all crazy, that's what I think.
Forrest's career spanned numerous films and TV shows over the years, but with his deep voice, imposing presence, and that mean mug, he was built for westerns. And this is especially evident in the fan-favorite Gunsmoke episode, Mannin, where he played a sadistic gunslinger who leaves Dodge City shaken.
In case there's a man or two here who hasn't heard or isn't sure.
Earlier on, I noted this segment had Serling's fingerprints all over it. And that's clear via the dialogue, which is sharp and poetic, but also razor-edged whenever characters are taking jabs, typically at the expense of Dictor.
The problem with you, Dictor, is you got no memory for things. Fast hand, slow brain.
Also, much like Serling's Western-centric Twilight Zone entries, the waiting room is similar in spirit and tone. But in my view, the most interesting Fifth Dimension tie-in here is a clear similarity to the waiting room and a certain Season 1 Twilight Zone episode. Now, I'd rather not spoil the episode in question here, but let's just say both stories feature a despicable lead character with an eerily grim fate.
Point looking a little clearer.
What point?
The point. We, all of us, made a vow with a gun.
The waiting room also serves as another one of Serling's morality tales, filled with somber reflection throughout. Clearly, he had little sympathy for violent criminals or those of low moral character. On the Twilight Zone, these types of characters often found themselves on the receiving end of some form of cosmic punishment. And that's also the case here. Dictor isn't a romanticized gunslinger who gets to ride off into the sunset.
It's closing time, Mr. Dictor.
However, more than just condemning outlaws from the Old West, the waiting room feels like Serling's broader statement on anyone who lacks empathy and thrives on violence. Lastly, let's touch on some of the most common criticisms for this one, its repetition and predictability.
$20, Mr. Dictor. That's what I risk a life and took a life for.
On the first point, I agree. Hearing each character's grim backstory before they walk off to their doom Probably would have played better if it was somehow streamlined. On my first watch, this didn't bother me much, but on a rewatch, I did feel it a bit more. As for the segment's supposed predictability, well, that's why I'll push back. Sure, we figure out early on that Dictor is likely dead, and it feels like we're just waiting for him to catch up. But not everything here is necessarily telegraphed. For instance, we see the ending right at the start. Dictor stumbles upon a dead body, which turns out to be his own. But on a first viewing, I doubt anyone would immediately jump to that conclusion. So the fact that they slipped that one by us is impressive. Plus, the notion of witnessing your own demise, well, that's pure nightmare fuel.
He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword. Update that, Mr. Dictor. Make it a gun.
All in all, the somber themes, eerie atmosphere, and of course that haunting final moment makes this a standout segment in Night Gallery. I'd rate The Waiting Room 4 out of 5 bottles of whiskey. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've seen The Waiting Room and have your own thoughts on it, feel free to drop a comment below. Until next time, take care, be well, later.